They say pain fades with time, but those people have never stood in a quiet kitchen, stirring coffee with shaking hands, while preparing to walk into the wedding of the woman who tore their family apart. I stood by the small window of my third-floor apartment, the morning light spilling in over worn tile and chipped countertops. It wasn't much, just a modest place on the edge of Scranton, Pennsylvania. But it was ours, mine and Aidan's, my son, my reason for everything. After the divorce, this little apartment became my anchor in a world that no longer felt familiar. That morning, as I cradled my coffee like it was the only thing keeping me grounded, my stomach twisted into knots. Today was the day I had dreaded ever since the invitation came in the mail. "Mum, I can't tie my tie." His voice floated from the living room, innocent, sweet. I turned to find Aidan struggling in front of the mirror, the red tie dangling like a puzzle he couldn't solve. I set my cup down and knelt beside him, gently smoothing the fabric. "It's a tricky one," I murmured, keeping my voice calm, steady. "But don't worry, Mom's got you." As I looped the knot with practiced fingers, a pang tightened in my chest. We were getting ready for a wedding I had no desire to attend. The wedding of Emily, my ex-husband's sister. The same Emily who had spent years reminding me I didn't belong. What no one else at that wedding knew, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that Emily hadn't just distanced herself from me after the divorce. She'd become something much worse. She'd become part of the betrayal. 3 years ago, I found out about Brian's affair. He didn't bother hiding it. His new lover, young, polished, and convenient, was the kind of woman his family had always imagined for him. I signed the divorce papers without a word, packed our bags, and moved in with my parents. No yelling, no begging, just silence. That was my dignity. But dignity doesn't protect you from being erased. Brian's family, especially his mother, Lorraine, made it clear I was never really one of them. And Emily, with her Ivy League degree and her high society smirk, had always looked at me like I was barely furniture in their perfect home. Aidan noticed. Children always do. "Grandma Lorraine and Aunt Emily, they don't like you, do they?" he once asked, his little brow furrowed. I smiled the kind of smile that hides things. "Grown-up relationships are complicated, sweetheart." But even at 8, he understood more than I gave him credit for. So when he looked up at me with hope in his eyes and said, "I want to see Dad," after the wedding invitation arrived, I swallowed my pride and said yes, not for them, for him. Now, dressed in a simple navy dress that I prayed would help me blend into the background, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. My hands shook as I zipped up the side. I wasn't ready for this, not the stares, not the whispers, and certainly not the cruel games I suspected were waiting. But I couldn't let Aidan know that, not yet. Just before we left, I knelt again and placed my hands gently on his shoulders. "No matter what happens today," I said, my voice clear despite the storm inside me, "we are family. Never forget that." He nodded, his trust in me absolute. We stepped out into the morning air, unaware that the hours ahead would unravel everything and reveal truths no one at that wedding was prepared to face. The taxi ride to the Silverwood Grand felt longer than it was, even though the hotel stood only 20 minutes from our apartment. With every passing mile, my pulse seemed to tap harder against my ribs, not in excitement or anticipation, but with that old, familiar tension. The kind that settles in when you're walking into a room full of people who once smiled to your face while sharpening the knives behind your back. Aidan sat beside me, fidgeting with his cufflinks, his little hands betraying the nervous energy he hadn't spoken aloud. I reached over and gave his fingers a gentle squeeze. He glanced at me and offered a small smile, but I could tell he felt it too. The weight of where we were going, the weight of who would be there. As we pulled up to the entrance, my breath caught. The Silverwood Grand was every bit as opulent as I remembered from when I had first entered it years ago, back when I was still Brian's wife. Back when Emily's opinion of me was still whispered behind closed doors instead of spoken aloud with thinly veiled scorn. Crystal chandeliers sparkled through floor-to-ceiling glass panes, their light reflecting off gleaming marble tiles that stretched endlessly into the grand hall. The entire building radiated the kind of extravagance that made people like me feel like intruders the moment we stepped through the door. A valet opened the door with a practiced bow and I stepped out, smoothing the creases in my dress while trying to keep my head high. Aidan followed close, his small hand slipping back into mine as if to remind me we were in this together. And we were. Always. Inside, the scent of roses and polished silver filled the air, mingling with the faintest hint of expensive perfume. Conversations buzzed all around us and laughter echoed through the vaulted ceilings. Laughter that didn't quite reach me, not when I recognized faces that had once smiled at my wedding, but now looked through me like I was a ghost haunting a party I was never supposed to return to. At the reception table, a young woman in a sleek black dress skimmed the guest list with a well-manicured finger. "Name, please?" she asked. "Margaret Elwood," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "And this is my son, Aidan." Her eyes paused on the page. A slight crease formed between her brows, then vanished just as quickly. "One moment," she said, stepping aside to whisper something to another staff member, who then glanced at us and disappeared into the crowd. I felt Aidan shift beside me, and I tightened my grip around his hand. A minute later, the woman returned with a too-wide smile, like someone trying to mask a bad secret. "Right this way," she said, her tone just a little too cheerful. She led us past the gilded columns and into the ballroom, where rows of meticulously arranged tables sparkled under the soft light. Then she stopped in front of a long table tucked near the back, smiled, and gestured. "Here's your table." At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. My eyes landed on two place cards. One marked single mother, waitress, the other her son. My breath hitched. I blinked, hoping I'd read it wrong, but there they were, in elegant cursive, labels not just dismissive but meant to humiliate. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. The sting was immediate, like ice water in the veins. Aidan read them too. I saw his hands ball into fists, his jaw tighten as his eyes clouded with confusion and something else. Hurt. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat, turned both cards face down, and forced my voice to stay steady. "Just a bad joke," I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't. We sat, surrounded by guests who didn't meet my gaze, who either didn't notice or didn't care. Some of them had once eaten meals I'd cooked, sat at tables I'd cleaned. Now they looked past me, as if seeing me would tarnish their perfect evening. Then, like royalty descending from a pedestal, Lorraine, the matriarch of the Foster family, and my former mother-in-law, made her grand entrance. Draped in silver silk and adorned with enough pearls to sink a boat, she moved with the confidence of someone who believed she was above reproach. Her gaze swept the room like a spotlight until it landed on me. And when it did, her lips curled into something just shy of a sneer. "Oh, Margaret." "You came," she said, the surprise in her voice sharpened by condescension. "And you brought little Aidan too. How charming." I smiled politely. There was no point in sparring with a woman who treated cruelty like sport. She turned on her heel without even acknowledging her grandson and floated away toward a crowd of guests who were far more appropriate in her eyes. The ceremony began shortly after, all soft violins and hollow vows. Emily entered in a dress that looked like it had been stitched from starlight, her smile as brilliant as the diamonds dripping from her ears. To most people she looked radiant. To me she looked triumphant, and not because she was in love, but because she believed she had won. I kept my face still, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing the hurt she might have hoped for. Let her shine, I thought. Let her bask. A storm was coming, and none of them could see the clouds gathering over their perfect little celebration. Dinner followed, served on gold-rimmed plates by waiters who glided silently between the tables like shadows. Then came the sound, Clink, 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 a spoon against a crystal glass. The room fell silent. Lorraine stood, microphone in hand, her smile as polished as the silverware. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "thank you for joining us on this beautiful day as we celebrate the union of my daughter Emily and her beloved fiancé." Polite applause followed. She paused, savouring the attention, then glanced toward our table. "Weddings," she continued, "are about family, love, and inclusion, which is why I'm particularly thrilled that we have someone very special joining us tonight. Our dear former family member, Margaret." A ripple of murmurs stirred as heads turned, my fingers tightened around the napkin in my lap. "Many of you may not know," Lorraine went on, her voice syrupy sweet, "but Margaret has worked tirelessly as a waitress for over a decade, truly a woman of service." Laughter broke out, soft but undeniable. And then came the dagger, slid in with a smile. "In fact, with all that experience, perhaps she wouldn't mind helping us serve the entrees this evening." This time the laughter was louder, crueler. My cheeks burned, but I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Brian, my ex-husband, lower his drink and look away, his silence louder than any insult. I wanted to leave. I wanted to take my son and walk out of that gleaming room and never look back. But something changed. Something shifted beside me. Aidan's chair scraped softly against the marble floor. And when I turned, I saw him standing, not with anger, not with confusion, but with quiet, powerful resolve. And that, I would soon learn, was the moment everything began to unravel. At first, the scrape of his chair against the marble floor was so subtle that it barely registered through the ringing in my ears, the laughter still echoing around the room like shards of broken glass. I was frozen, locked in the kind of stillness that comes not from fear, but from deep humiliation. An icy silence that burrows into your chest when you've just been publicly reduced to a punchline. And then, through that haze, I felt it. Aidan was no longer sitting beside me. I turned and saw him standing there, small and solemn in his navy blazer, his hands curled into gentle fists by his sides, his shoulders squared in a way I'd never seen before. The entire room had gone quiet now, the kind of silence that follows when cruelty has finally exhausted its laugh track. Aidan's eyes scanned the sea of unfamiliar faces, the adults dressed in satin and silk who had just moments ago chuckled at my expense. His gaze didn't falter. He walked forward, unhurried, unshaken, and headed straight toward the stage. I barely managed to whisper his name, too low for anyone but myself to hear because deep down, I understood. This moment wasn't mine to stop. The band had just finished resetting their instruments when Aidan approached the microphone, the technician reaching instinctively to lower it before realizing the boy intended to speak. At first there was hesitation in the room, a few raised brows, some light murmuring, but no one stopped him. Maybe they were amused. Maybe they thought a child couldn't possibly matter. Or maybe they simply hadn't realized yet that everything was about to change. He cleared his throat softly, adjusted the microphone with both hands, and began. "Please stop making fun of my mom." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear, calm, and utterly without apology. You could feel the tension in the air shift, as if the chandeliered ceiling itself leaned in to listen. No one moved. Even the servers paused mid-step, their trays suspended in the air. "My mum works harder than anyone I know," he continued, his eyes now focused not on one person, but on everyone. "She wakes up before the sun just to pack my lunch. She helps me with homework even when she's so tired she can barely keep her eyes open, and she spends all day smiling at people who don't always treat her kindly, just so I can have what I need." My hands trembled under the table. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't, not because I was ashamed, but because I was in awe. My son, my quiet, thoughtful Aidan, was standing in front of 100 people and telling the truth they refused to see. "She doesn't complain," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Not even when people treat her like she's less. But just because someone's kind doesn't mean you get to treat them like they don't matter." There was a shuffling at the head table. Lorraine, the matriarch who moments earlier had delivered her backhanded speech, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Emily's painted-on smile had faltered, and even Brian was now sitting upright, his hand twitching near his drink, as though bracing for impact. Then Lorraine spoke, trying to laugh her way through the tension. "Sweet boy," she said, her voice steeped in patronizing warmth. "Why don't we let the grown-ups enjoy the evening? I'll have the waitstaff bring you some extra dessert. How about that? Chocolate, maybe even 2 scoops?" Aidan didn't blink. "I don't want ice cream," he said plainly. "I want people to stop treating my mom like she's nothing, because she's not." It wasn't just a child's plea, it was a verdict. Gasps echoed faintly across the room, some in disbelief, others in dawning realization. But Aidan wasn't finished. He took a deep breath, and what came next unraveled every carefully constructed lie in that hall. "I wasn't going to say anything today," he admitted, his small fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the podium. "But after what just happened, I think it's time people knew the truth." Emily straightened visibly in her seat, her eyes darting toward Brian and then toward Lorraine, who had gone rigid. I felt my breath hitch, not from fear, but from recognition. I had no idea what he was about to say, but whatever it was, it had weight. "3 days ago," he said, steady and unshaken, "I went to Aunt Emily's house. I was walking to piano practice and Mom had asked me to drop off a letter she forgot to mail, but when I got there, Dad's car was outside." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I knocked, but no one answered," he said. "The front door wasn't shut all the way, so I opened it a little, and I heard them talking." Emily's hands had gripped the edge of the table. Brian's face was pale now, the colour draining slowly as Aidan reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. It was the old phone Brian had given him for his birthday, a hand-me-down, something he probably thought would never come back to haunt him. But Aidan had always been sharper than he let on. "I recorded it," he said simply. There was a beat of static, then the unmistakable sound of Emily's voice filled the room, piped through the speakers that had just hours ago played the wedding march. "I want to see Margaret's face when she walks in and sees the place cards. Single mother, waitress. It's perfect. Lorraine's on board too." A collective gasp broke from the guests. A glass shattered somewhere in the back. Still, the audio continued. Brian's voice followed. "You need to be careful. If people find out you're pregnant, everything falls apart." Emily: "James doesn't know anything. Once we're married, it'll be too late. I timed everything. He'll think the baby's his." The chaos that erupted in the ballroom was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Emily's groom, James, sat in stunned silence. His hands trembled as he stared blankly ahead, his wedding band suddenly feeling like a foreign object. His father stood up slowly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder with a gravity that said everything words couldn't. "We're leaving," he said, his voice as sharp as cut glass. Emily shot up from her seat, frantic and desperate. "James, please, I can explain. He's just a kid. He misunderstood." But James had already removed his ring and set it gently on the table. Brian sat with his face buried in his hands, unable to look at anyone. And Lorraine, who had once carried herself like the queen of that family, stood paralysed, the illusion shattered, her reputation unravelling with every passing second. Aidan walked back to me, slipping his hand into mine without a word. I leaned down, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I replied, tears finally falling. "You were brave." As we rose and walked out of that glittering, broken hall, I didn't look back. Not at Lorraine, not at Brian, not at Emily sobbing into her bouquet. For the first time in years, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt free. The heavy doors of the Silverwood Grand closed behind us with a thud that echoed like a full stop at the end of a chapter I had long needed to finish. The cold air outside hit my skin like a baptism, crisp and clean and completely unlike the suffocating tension we'd just left behind. For a moment, I simply stood there, breathing it in, letting the silence of the street settle into the space that had once been filled with whispers, mockery, and cruel laughter. Aidan was still holding my hand, his grip firm, not with fear but with something stronger, resolve. He didn't ask me if we were okay, and I didn't ask him how he felt, because somehow we both knew the answer without speaking. We had walked into that place humiliated and outnumbered, but we were walking out whole. Behind us, the ballroom buzzed with chaos. Voices raised in shock, heels clicking frantically against marble, chairs scraping as guests left their seats. Some stunned, others scandalized, all of them witnesses to the shattering of a carefully curated lie. I could almost picture Lorraine scrambling to regain control, her voice sharp, her composure cracking as she tried to salvage the family image she had spent years polishing with judgment and cruelty. And Emily, whose face had collapsed into a mask of disbelief and mascara-streaked shame, was likely still frozen at the head table, watching everything she had built crumble in front of the very people she had once tried to impress. Brian hadn't chased us. He hadn't said a word. In the end, that silence told me more than any apology ever could. For a man who once claimed I wasn't enough, it was now clear that I had never been the one lacking. We walked toward the curb where the same yellow cab that had brought us earlier still waited, the driver having lingered with a quiet kindness I didn't expect. I opened the door and helped Aidan in, sliding beside him and closing it behind us without once turning around. Not out of spite, but because there was simply nothing back there worth seeing anymore. As the taxi pulled away from the hotel, I looked out the window, not at the building but at the sky above it, which was beginning to darken with the slow hush of evening. I felt Aidan shift beside me, and when I glanced down, he was watching me with that same thoughtful intensity he had always carried. "You okay, Mom?" he asked softly. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and for the first time in years the answer came easily. "I think I am," I said, my voice lighter than it had been in a long time. "I really think I am." We rode in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that doesn't press down but lifts, like a weight finally being set aside. I looked at my reflection in the cab window, not to fix my hair or check my face, but just to see myself as I was in that moment. Not broken, not defeated, just me. A woman who had endured betrayal, who had been humiliated in front of people who once called her family, but who had not allowed any of it to define her. What mattered now was the boy beside me, who had shown a room full of adults what courage really looked like. What mattered was that we had walked out, heads high, dignity intact, with nothing but truth and love holding us upright. And the remarkable thing was, we hadn't needed to scream, or fight, or stoop to their level. All it took was a voice that refused to stay quiet, a child who stood tall when no one else would, and a mother who finally realized that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply walking away without a trace of regret. The weeks that followed our quiet departure from the Silverwood Grand passed in a strange kind of peace, one that felt fragile at first, like morning frost on a window pane, beautiful but likely to vanish the moment life turned its heat back up. But it didn't melt. Instead, something new began to take root inside me, not loud or showy but steady, like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand fully. At the diner where I'd worked for over a decade, wiping down tables and pouring coffee for regulars who rarely learned my name, things began to shift. It started subtly. More eye contact from the manager, fewer dismissive looks from the younger staff, and then one afternoon, as I was refilling the sugar jars before the dinner rush, Mr. Harlan called me into his office. "You've been with us a long time, Margaret," he said, leaning back in his chair with a weariness that seemed to come from carrying too many years of small business ownership. "You've worked hard, stayed loyal, and never once made excuses. I think it's about time someone acknowledged that." I stood there, not knowing whether to brace for a firing or a new shift schedule. What I wasn't prepared for was his next sentence. "I'd like to promote you to assistant manager." The words didn't land all at once. I had to let them settle in, like rain on dry soil. And when they did, something inside me broke, not in pain, but in release. I nodded slowly, too choked up to speak, and he smiled kindly, like a man who'd seen someone walk through fire and come out with their spirit intact. Not long after, word of what had happened at the wedding began to spread, not through tabloids or gossip blogs, but through the quiet, relentless machinery of small-town conversation. At first, I feared judgment, but what came instead were knowing nods, unexpected smiles, and even strangers stopping by the diner just to say they'd heard what my son had done. "You raised a lion-hearted boy," one woman said, her hand wrapped tightly around mine. "We need more men like him." And she was right, because Aidan had changed too. Something in him had grown stronger, not arrogant or brash, but rooted. At school, he walked taller. His teachers told me he had found a voice, one that others actually listened to. And when he came home one afternoon with a certificate in his hand and a grin stretched across his face, he threw his backpack down and announced, "I won the class debate." I asked him what the topic was. "Standing up for what's right," he said, eyes shining. I pulled him into a hug so tight he laughed. And in that moment, I realized something vital. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. 3 evenings a week, after closing up at the diner, I walked into a classroom at the local community college. At first, I felt out of place among students decades younger, my hands rough from years of labor and my notebooks filled with nervous handwriting. But I kept coming back. I was studying nutrition, something I had always loved but never believed I was allowed to pursue. And the more I learned, the more I remembered who I used to be before life knocked the air out of me and called it growing up. One night, as I sat at the kitchen table reviewing flashcards under the warm kitchen light, Aidan wandered in and flopped into the chair across from me. "Mum," he said, resting his chin on his hands, "do you think maybe one day you could open your own restaurant?" I blinked, surprised not by the question but by how quickly my heart answered. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I think I just took the first step." His grin lit up the room. "Then when you open it, I'll be your first customer, and I want your meatloaf on the menu. That's non-negotiable." I laughed, the kind of deep belly laugh I hadn't felt in years, and as he leaned back and started naming dishes I should include, I realized something so simple, so powerful. I was no longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I was building with what remained. There were still difficult days, moments when doubt crept in like a draft under the door. But now I had tools. I had direction. I had a son who believed in me so fiercely that it was impossible not to believe in myself. As for Brian, the scandal cost him more than his reputation. He lost his job quietly, let go from his firm with a severance check and a firm request not to return. Doors that once opened easily now shut without ceremony. The man who had once told me I wasn't enough was now learning the cost of betrayal in silence, as those who once applauded him turned away. Emily, unable to bear the stares and whispered judgment, left town altogether. Last I heard, she was raising her child alone, facing the very reality she once mocked me for living through. And Lorraine, once the queen of her social circle, found herself uninvited from events she used to host, her calls unanswered by the very people she had tried to impress for decades. One day, I received a letter from her. Thick, expensive stationery, her handwriting unmistakable. It said, "I was wrong about everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." I stared at those words for a long time before writing a short reply. I can let the past go, but I won't forget it. That was all. It was enough. Now, every morning I pin a small silver badge to my uniform, assistant manager, Maple Avenue Diner, and I wear it not as proof of a title, but as a reminder that healing doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly at the end of a long, hard road, wearing comfortable shoes and smelling faintly of coffee and possibility. And every night, as Aidan and I curl up on the couch, watching some old movie and passing a bowl of popcorn back and forth, I look at his face, soft, focused, filled with peace. And I know we didn't just survive what they tried to do to us. We rose, we rebuilt, we began again. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that even after the deepest betrayal, there is always a way back to yourself. Subscribe for more powerful true life stories of quiet courage, unexpected justice, and second chances.